Over the past year, the war in Ukraine has profoundly affected international relations. Since the start of the full-scale Russian invasion in February 2022, many countries have fundamentally reassessed their alignment on the world stage. However, even in Europe, some states seem determined to retain neutrality. One of the most interesting is Austria. Even though most of its European partners are committed to helping Ukraine, it remains firmly neutral. But why does it seem to want to hold on to this at all costs? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Kerr-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has wholly transformed the security environment in Europe. For most European Union members, which are already members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, the continent's key military alliance, this has meant a renewed commitment to enhancing their defence capabilities. After years of falling military spending, many have pledged to meet the 2% of gross domestic product expected under NATO commitments. Meanwhile, as well as upgrading their defence systems, many have been supporting Ukraine by sending arms. In other cases, the effects have been far more significant. Several European countries have entirely re-evaluated their foreign and security orientation. This was highlighted when Finland and Sweden decided to give up their long-standing neutrality and apply to join NATO. However, a few European states remain neutral and show little immediate wish to change. One of the most interesting of these is Austria. It's made it clear that it has no intention of reviewing its position. The Republic of Austria lies at the very heart of continental Europe. Landlocked, it's surrounded by 8 neighbours. To its north are Germany and the Czech Republic, to its east are Slovakia and Hungary, and to its south are Slovenia and Italy. Switzerland and the tiny Principality of Liechtenstein lie along its western border. At around 84,000 square kilometres or 32,000 square miles, it's the 113th largest member of the United Nations. Its population currently stands at a fraction under 9 million. Its GDP per capita is around $54,000. This is slightly more than neighbouring Germany and significantly higher than the EU average of $38,000. Austria has long been central to European history. First settled around 10,000 years ago, by 400 BCE, the Celts inhabited the territory. After that, it was conquered by the Romans and then by Germanic tribes. However, Austria really began to emerge around 800 AD when Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, established the Ostmark, or Eastern March. Having become the Duchy of Austria by 1156, by the late 13th century it had come under the control of Rudolf I, King of Germany. Hailing from the Habsburg family, over the following centuries his descendants would extend Austria's control over neighbouring territories. This included Hungary in the 17th century. Then, at the start of the 19th century, the Austrian Empire became a part of the German Confederation, a loose collection of almost 40 sovereign states that replaced the Holy Roman Empire. This lasted until 1867, when, following a war with Prussia, its key rival, it was excluded from the new German state, instead becoming the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This ended with its defeat in the First World War. The empire was carved up and Austria became an independent republic. And while it at first tried to secure union with Germany, this was forbidden under the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. However, despite this prohibition, the dream of union remained a powerful force in certain quarters, and 20 years later, in 1938, Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany. The following year, the Second World War broke out. The end of the war had a profound effect on Austria. Like Germany, it was also occupied by the Allied powers, Britain, France, the United States and the Soviet Union. However, unlike its northern neighbour, even though it shared a border with Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe, it managed to avoid being partitioned as the Cold War set in. Instead, in 1955, Allied forces withdrew under the terms of the Austrian State Treaty, re-establishing Austria as a fully independent, sovereign and democratic country within its 1938 borders. The treaty prohibited any form of political or economic union with Germany. In return, and following long and complex discussions with the Soviet Union, Austria issued a declaration of neutrality. This not only meant that it wouldn't join any military alliances, but that it wouldn't allow any foreign military bases on its territory. Having been enshrined in the country's constitution, neutrality now became a defining feature of the country's international orientation over the following decades. And even after the end of the Cold War, it stuck to this position. Unlike many of its neighbours that had been part of the Soviet-controlled Warsaw Pact and now decided to join NATO, Austria remained outside the Western alliance. And even though it eventually joined NATO's Partnership for Peace programme, it only did so after Russia and Belarus had joined, and after two other large neutral states, Finland and Sweden, had also signed up. Since then, Austrian neutrality has rarely raised any discussion. It was just taken as given. That was until the start of the war in Ukraine. The decision by Sweden and Finland, both of which have long and very different traditions of neutrality, to join NATO naturally focused attention on the last four remaining EU members outside the alliance, including Austria. So, could it actually happen? First and foremost, it's important to stress that there's little public support for giving up neutrality, let alone joining NATO. Unlike Sweden and Austria, where the war in Ukraine changed public opinion, especially given their proximity to Russia, Austria has seen no such change. Opinion polls show that support for neutrality has in fact grown since the start of the war. While polls regularly showed that over 75% of Austrians supported neutrality before the conflict, the latest figures show that this has grown to over 90% since the Russian invasion. However, this isn't to say that there aren't calls for the country to reassess its position. For example, an open letter by over 50 leading figures from across the political spectrum called on the country's president to re-examine the policy of neutrality, considering changing international circumstances. However, this is very much a minority position. More to the point, there's little political will for change. As the Austrian Chancellor stated a couple of months after the start of the Ukraine war, Austria was neutral, Austria is neutral, and Austria will remain neutral. So, what are the arguments for and against ditching neutrality? On the one hand, there are solid arguments in favour of change. For a start, the international environment has clearly changed. The Cold War is long since over, and Austria no longer faces a Soviet threat on its borders. Neutrality is no longer about self-preservation, as it once was. Meanwhile, Europe now faces a new threat that would be better tackled through a show of solidarity. By joining Sweden and Finland in NATO, Austria would send a powerful message to Russia that Europe is truly united in protecting its security interests. Tied to this is the argument that Austria is currently freeloading. Surrounded on most sides by NATO, observers have pointed out that Austria has been underspending on defence for years. And while many in Austria don't see the need for spending more given that it's far from Russia and faces no immediate challenge, detractors argue that it's all very well to sit back and feel safe knowing that its neighbours will fend off any threat. Then there's the argument that it's already given up critical aspects of neutrality. By joining the European Union, it has already entered an alliance of sorts, as members are expected to come to one another's aid in the event of an attack. Finally, there's no significant legal impediment to change. Formally speaking, neutrality was a voluntary decision by an independent sovereign state. This means that it can be revoked. And while it may have been written into the constitution, constitutions can of course change. But opponents of change counter these points. For instance, they argue that there's simply no need for Austria to alter its position. The current arrangements cover the most critical eventuality. As a member of the European Union, Austria is committed to come to the aid of a fellow EU member. However, the war in Ukraine doesn't involve such a scenario. In the meantime, Austrian leaders have long made it clear that military neutrality doesn't mean political neutrality, and never has. The country has always been firmly part of the West. More to the point, Austria's signed up to EU sanctions on Russia. But they also argue that formal military neutrality gives the country a significant role to play as an international mediator or interlocutor. For example, the Austrian Chancellor became the first Western leader to visit Moscow after the start of the invasion and was able, therefore, to convey a tough message to the Russian leader that other European countries couldn't. Likewise, Austria provides a neutral ground for parties to meet. Vienna hosts the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. With 57 members, including Russia and Ukraine, this remains a valuable forum for discussion. But while all this may be true, critics argue that there is in fact a darker side to all this. For years there have been allegations about the seemingly close relationship between Austria and Russia and between some Austrian political figures and the Russian leadership. For example, this came to international attention in 2018 when Vladimir Putin was a guest at the wedding of the then Austrian foreign minister. And more recently, there have been complaints that while Austria has signed up to EU sanctions, it hasn't always seemed to do so willingly. On top of this, there have been complaints that Austria is in fact giving a platform to Russian propaganda. As for the charge that it's freeloading, this is a slightly more challenging point to counter. While it may see itself as defended by its European partners, many would also point out that Austria contributes to broader European defence and security in other ways. For instance, despite its neutrality, the country has a long history of participating in international peace support and humanitarian operations. These include the UN peacekeeping missions in Lebanon and Cyprus, the NATO mission in Kosovo, and the EU mission in Bosnia. Indeed, the Austrian army notes that since 1960, it's been deployed in over 50 such operations worldwide. But whatever the arguments either way, there's little sign that Austria will change its position on military neutrality. Most Austrians and the country's political leaders clearly have little desire for change. Of course, one could say that neutrality has now become so deeply enshrined in the country's identity that ordinary Austrians just don't think about how and why it came about, nor do they consider why it should be changed, even given the radically different and rapidly shifting international security environment. But while this may be true, it doesn't seem particularly convincing, especially given how Sweden and Finland have opened the debate. Indeed, even neighbouring Switzerland, famed for its neutrality, appears more willing to discuss its attachment to the principle of neutrality than Austria is. Ultimately, therefore, and for whatever reason, one just gets the sense that Austria simply doesn't want to have a debate about its neutrality. Before I go, I'd like to say a huge thank you to World Politics Review for kindly sponsoring today's video. If you haven't checked it out already, please do take a look at their fantastic offer for channel viewers. I put a link here as well as in the description below. In the meantime, if you're interested in more from me, here's another video that you might find helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.